Thank you. Now there's some housekeeping things for all campuses. I'd still like to know from all the campuses, including Wollongong, I don't want names because I'm not interested in privacy issues here, whether any local government representatives, whether they be elected or whether they are public servants or members of Parliament, have turned up for any of these lectures since the first one on the 5th of December. I really would like that information because of two things. One, I've been asked by the media, and secondly, I'd like to know whether in fact there is anybody out there who's in an elected position or in a public servant position is at all interested enough to come along and listen to at least one of our presentations. Now, I know there are a couple that have, and of course we should give them full credit, and Sandra McCarthy, the Mayor of Kiama, has attended regularly, and people know who attended last week. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that for homework, this is the first time I've ever given you homework, I think if you haven't already done so, look up the parliamentary websites and then you can ascertain, if you don't already know, the numbers of people in the Senate, where they come from, in the House of Representatives, in the Upper House New South Wales, the Lower House New South Wales, and see the possibilities from that website in terms of accessing, and many of you would have already done this, of course, accessing speeches and committee reports and things of that nature. I haven't bounced this off Glenn yet, but in the last session, I would like to think that we could ask you some questions as to what your concept of parliamentary democracy at the local, state and federal level is now compared with what it was on the 5th of December. Whether in fact you've learned something, you've changed your mind or whatever. And the questions that you might ask us on the last day, because there are aspects, because of the density of the material that we've given you, that you want a little bit more detail on or direction as to where to go. The last point I want to make is rather controversial, and I have to keep the university out of this. I'll be calling on people in all campuses and in all communities to sign up, if they wish to, separate from the university through my wife's website, to form a people empowerment party to stand for local and state and federal elections. And for that you will need at least 750 signatures, verifiable, of people who are not members of political parties, but who have signed up and are registered voters, in our case New South Wales. And that's got to happen, plenty of time, you've got a fortnight. Now, if you're interested in that, just simply contact me, and we have to do that away from the university. And the website is vhatton, all one word for Vera, vhatton, at Shoalhaven, all lowercase, vhatton at Shoalhaven, SHOALHAVEN.net.au, and we'll take it from there. I'll give you the 10 commandments. Simply to say this has got nothing to do with party platforms. In fact, it's got everything not to do with party platforms. The 7 commandments will be things like freedom of information, right of access, free speech and so on, the basic principles of access to our democracy. So it won't be deal with ideology. Now, I can't say any more about that except to say that that has to happen privately outside of this room if you're interested, and if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen.
John, I just missed that. Can you repeat what that was?
People Empowerment Party, right? And by the time I get back to you, I will have the 10 commandments and in a couple of weeks' time, I hope to have citizen-formulated law. In other words, we don't trust you anymore to write freedom of information. This is the legislation we want you to sign up with. And so on and so on. Okay, so Harry Evans, one of my heroes, and I'm very proud to be in his shoes today. I would have preferred him to come. He was very keen to come. I've spoken with him on the phone several times. I sent him a copy of a paper that I put out at the 2007 election and got very good response from him. He has just retired as the clerk of the Senate. From 83 to 87, he was the assistant clerk. Now, as the assistant clerk, he was secretary to the parliamentary committees of the Senate. You'll see the importance of those in a moment when I read his speech, because the workings of the parliamentary committee, if they work the way they were designed to work, is people empowerment, people right to know at its best. In 1987, he became the clerk of the Senate. Since taking up that position, why he's a hero of mine is that he has been very outspoken. He has said that Parliament is dominated by the executive, Parliament is not performing in the way it ought to, the way it was originally designed to, and consequently he made himself and has made himself very unpopular. He wrote a book, Constitutional and Party Government in Australia. I haven't got the publisher of that handy. This paper is under the heading in your course of authorities, possibilities, flaws within the Australian parliamentary system. Now, for the transcripts that we hope will be made of all of these speeches, whenever I speak, I will make it clear so that it's my words and not Harry Evans. So, Parliament, an unreformable institution by Harry Evans on the 13th of July 1992 and re-edited on the 26th of October 1992. In all countries which have inherited the system of government described as parliamentary movements for parliamentary reform, which characterised the 1960s and 1970s, have given way in the 1980s and the 1990s to demand for more radical constitutional changes. Over that period, the main target of the reformers' attacks, executive control of Parliament, has remained largely impervious. In other words, nothing's happening. Are the demands for reform merely reflective of the discontents of intellectuals, not justified by the problems with the institution themselves? Or is this development a sign of the increasing incapacity of the institution to cope? What reform measures are most likely to be adopted and most likely to succeed? What are the implications for Australia? In this lecture, the Clerk of the Senate surveys events and issues and suggests some conclusions with practical implications for the Australian Parliament. He has cited at the end of this paper, which I've given to Glenn to put on the website, the appropriate references. The Senate Department has been conducting these occasional lectures since 1988, and the first lecture in that year was on the Revolution of 1688. Little did we know that then that we were living in a revolutionary era all of our own. Since that time, we've had a long line of very distinguished lecturers, you might say, quote, "The long line comes to an end here," unquote. But I hope this one will not be the start of the decline of the series. There are two reasons for this lecture. Having on so many occasions introduced other lecturers, I had a strong inclination to get in my 2 cents worth. And secondly, it's very difficult to get speakers to come to Canberra in the middle of winter. I'm tempted to use the Shakespearean line, quote, "Now is the winter of our discontent," unquote, which is somewhat inappropriate because the subject of this lecture is the discontent with the workings of the parliamentary system of government over the last 30 years or so, and the outcome of this discontent. By the parliamentary system, I mean the system whereby government is carried on by a ministry formed by the majority party in the lower house of the Parliament, the system which has been inherited from the United Kingdom by many countries, and particularly the old Commonwealth countries of Australia, Canada, New Zealand. In all of these countries, the workings of the parliamentary system has been perceived to have similar problems, and the discontent with its operations has led to a parliamentary reform movement. He then goes on to say that these have waxed and waned over the years. The purpose of this lecture is to examine the perceived problems with the institutions, the parliamentary reform movement and its manifestations and significance, and to suggest some conclusions, particularly with reference to Australia. The fundamental reason for the discontent with the parliamentary system to which I've referred is the tendency in all these countries towards stronger and stronger executive government, control over Parliament through the operation of the parliamentary system. Executive domination of Parliament has been the great theme of the parliamentary reform movements, and the phase which catches this theme is that Parliament has become a rubber stamp. It is perceived that there has been a significant change in the role of Parliament in that it has ceased to perform its traditional role as a check on executive government in both senses of scrutiny and restraint, and has become a mere tool of those wielding executive power. Instead of executive government being responsible to Parliament, Parliaments have become responsible to executive governments. The body which is supposed to be scrutinised and controlled by Parliament has actually come to control the body which is supposed to be doing the scrutinising and controlling, a reversal of roles. Now that's a very powerful statement coming from the Clerk of the Senate, whose career has been involvement as a clerk within the parliamentary institution for decades. He goes on, the reason for this change is it is universally agreed is the rise of the modern political party. A highly cohesive and tightly disciplined organisation, the aim of which is to ensure that all of its members in Parliament always vote with the party, and when the party is in the majority, always support the government formed by the party. The executive government was supposed to be responsible to the lower house of Parliament. The modern political party has grown up as a device for avoiding that responsibility, to make sure that the executive is responsible for the party and not to the Parliament. Now, this was written in 1992, and a lot has happened since then. Later he says, this system of two highly disciplined parties competing for the executive power and turning Parliament into a mere electioneering forum is no more than 100 years old, having emerged in the United Kingdom in 1880s and gradually spread to colonies in the early part of this century. The parliamentary reform movements to which I've referred are essentially about what to do to correct this problem of the reduction of Parliament to a rubber stamp and the degeneration of its scrutiny and control function. It's very easy to be cynical about the demands of parliamentary reform, as it is about the workings of Parliament itself. A Canadian correspondent of mine, who was a long-time student of parliamentary matters, observed that when the government had a secure and compliant majority in the Canadian House of Commons, people complained about Parliament being a rubber stamp. When there was a minority government and Parliament operated as the United Kingdom Parliament did between the two reform bills, as the scrutineer and controller of the executive, people complained about the instability of government. There's a good deal of truth in this, but underlying the demands for parliamentary reform are very real problems with parliamentary institutions as they operate. I hope, with your permission, I'm not going to read the entire speech, but I'll pick the areas that I've highlighted, and I hope that Harry Evans agrees. No sooner had Mr Gladstone won the 1880 election and the modern two-party system was established than authors such as Sir Harry Mayne were warning of the dangers of the control of Parliament by latter-day Napoleons, claiming a popular mandate and using their party majority to overwhelm all opposition. the discussion and agitation for parliamentary reform was particularly a phenomenon in the 1960s and 1970s, starting in the late 1950s. He then goes on to talk about the vast amount of literature in the United Kingdom on this subject of parliamentary reform. 1950 House of Commons and extending into elaborate programs of specific reforms, probably the high watermark of the movement occurred in 1964 with the publication of a book entitled The Reform of Parliament by Professor Bernard Crick, a professor of political science who became a high priest of the movement and whose program became the established orthodoxy. Discontent with Parliament was by no means confined to radicals, and some of the most devastatingly critical and significant contributions were made by the Conservative Lord Chancellor, Lord Halsham. It's not true, by the way, that to become a parliamentary reformer only when there was a Labor government in office, and some of his trenchant observations were made after some years under Thatcher, which may be significant. The demand for parliamentary reform spread from the United Kingdom to the Dominions, as they were still called, extremely quickly. By the mid-1960s, all of those countries, the movement the movement was weakest in Australia, a matter to which I shall return, although it was still much in evidence. I recall reading in 1965 or thereabouts an essay by a well-known member of the House of Representatives, H.B. Turner, in which he described the problem of executive control of Parliament and set out his own remedies, particularly an expanded committee system. Now, John Hatton will come back to that expanded committee system and examine whether, in fact, this proposal worked. He then goes on, perhaps the most conspicuous opponent of parliamentary reform in Australia was the late Professor Gordon Reid, who subsequently became... Perhaps the most conspicuous proponent of parliamentary reform in Australia was the late Professor Gordon Reid, who subsequently became Governor of Western Australia and whose writings may be taken as representative of the parliamentary reform literature of Australia. Now, obviously, John Hatton's words again, the significance of that is that we're not talking radical stuff here. We go back to the setting of this course, that community empowerment is to operate within the system but ensure that the system operates. And it has its roots back in 1880 with Conservatives in the House of Commons and with a governor as well as an academic, Crick, and then a governor, Turner I should say, and then a person who, Professor Gordon Reid, who later became Governor of Western Australia. So there's two schools of thought in these movements. Those who believe that the problem of parliamentary government could be rectified only by radical constitution or institutional changes. So I'll pause and just comment on that on the way through. We can't change the constitution in Australia unless you get the support of the major political parties. So that's clearly blocked off. Remember my statement that parliamentarians are only interested in power and not in change. And the history of getting constitutional reform through a referendum in Australia is pretty bleak. The radicals tended to consider that the parliamentary system contained a fatal flaw in the combination of the legislative and executive powers in the cabinet, and that supervision of the executive by the legislature could not be restored except by major changes in the institution of government, generally speaking involving some greater separation of the executive and the legislature. Now, there is literature on the way it operates in America, for example, where there is a clear separation. This school, he goes on, this school of thought often manifested itself as a hankering after the American system of the separation of legislative and executive branches, and it was reflected in the editorials in The Economist for some years, but not in recent times. It's not generally known that the then leader of the Labor Party, Arthur Caldwell, in a speech in the House of Representatives in 1965, said that the parliamentary system was hopeless and that Australia would have to embrace a presidential stroke congressional system. The dominant school of thought, however, was that the moderate procedural reformers. They thought the problem of Parliament failing to supervise or control the executive could be at least partly overcome by modest and piecemeal procedural reforms. And this was the dominant view in the 1960s and 1970s. Professor Crick made much of his avoidance of radical institutional changes in which category he included, for example, proportional representation. His program involved equipping the House of Commons with the procedural means of better scrutinising the executive. So we now come to this idea of the fact that you can reform Parliament by expanding and enhancement of the parliamentary committee system. Let me talk about that for a moment then, as John Hatton. There are a number of different types of committees that can be formed by any Houses of Parliament. There's the standing committees, which are in existence at all times and look at particular areas. And then there are committees that are set up to look at particular subjects. They could be all party committees, or you can have party committees which are set up by the Labor Party or the Liberal Party or the National Party. They set up their own committee, not a parliamentary committee, but a committee to examine particular issues. I want to diverge a moment and talk about my experience in that regard. The idea of the parliamentary committee was that if we formed a parliamentary committee here, we are all members of the Senate, we'll say, and we are examining certain matters, then we could ask, as do the committees in the United States, we could ask ministers to come before us to give evidence under oath and be cross-examined. Parliamentary committees have extraordinary powers. They're the highest court in the land. And frankly, in my opinion, that's why they had to be nobbled. Because you could call, for example, the Bankers' Trust if you wanted to examine them in regard to how banks operate in this country. You could call, for example, the Minister, the Attorney General, the Prime Minister. And in the paper that I put out in 2007, you will see where I cite the number of times that Presidents of the United States have been called before Senate committees in the United States and give evidence. Not in Australia, where the Prime Ministers give evidence only if they choose. And not in Australia, where under Howard, he completely neutered the Senate committee system by lack of resources, by time constraints, because the House sets up the committee. The House would give you its terms of reference. The House would give you the time to report back. And in some cases, he gave them a few weeks. Well, you need a few weeks to decide what your program's going to be. And I'm talking now as a chairman of a committee. What happens is, I'm a chairman of a committee, I have a staff provided. I have a secretary, and I have research officers. I have a terms of reference. And I have a working meeting with the members of the committee, and we say, now, where are the terms of reference going to take us? Who do we need to examine? Who are we going to subpoena? Who are we going to ask to appear? What are we going to ask them? What are the areas we think are important to explore? You can't do that under a couple of weeks. Zap. Immediately Howard sidelined the committee. The next thing he did was quite extraordinary, and I mentioned it in a previous lecture. He forbade public servants, without his permission, from appearing before a parliamentary committee. I never ever thought that I would see that in a democratic country in my life. You elect the Parliament. The Parliament is the supreme court of the land. It is the supreme organisation. Nobody, and I mean nobody, not even Murdoch or Packer or any of the other powerful people, the chairman of the Bankers Trust or whatever, can refuse to come a subpoena to come and give evidence before a parliamentary committee under oath. Now that should be rock solid, and it isn't. Ministers just simply say, I'm not coming. Not only that, I'm not going to have my members of staff come. We pay those members of staff. They don't belong to them. And so in the Children Overboard scandal, the committee didn't get to find out directly because they couldn't subpoena people from within the Prime Minister's department or within the Department of Immigration or Foreign Affairs if those ministers said we're not coming. That to me is extraordinary, and let me tell you, the parliamentary committee system hasn't really recovered from that, and it worries me. It would be Harry Evans goes on to say, it would be no exaggeration to say that the whole parliamentary reform movement was a movement for parliamentary committees, a comprehensive, subject specialised standing committee system for the House of Commons was the centrepiece of Crick's reform. Later on he says, quote, he quotes the catch cry, quote, get the business of Parliament into committees, unquote, was the cry. And there the stranglehold of the ministry will be weakened. The business to be dealt with in a more parliamentary fashion and the government held more effectively accountable. Later he then goes on, the British House of Commons established a comprehensive committee system, and one of the first measures of the then newly installed Thatcher government in 1979. The Canadian House of Commons and the New Zealand House of Representatives strengthened and enhanced their systems of committees in the 1960s and again in the 1980s. Also, after a period of experimentation with select committees, the Australian Senate established a comprehensive standing committee system in 1970. My words, that's a fairly late run for us to even look at the subject. Harry Evans goes on, it was a remarkable instance of the way in which the practical measures are influenced by the prevalence of an idea whose time appears to have come. Accompanying the establishment of an improvement of the committee systems were many other procedural measures which can also be traced back through literature of the parliamentary reform movement. So what was achieved? It's the question he asks. It's generally agreed that the expansion of the committee work has improved the performance of various parliaments as monitors and scrutineers of policy and administration. And the committee systems have done a great deal of good work. It's fairly clear that all of the parliaments concerned perform better in this regard than the predecessors in the 1950s. Contrary to the expectations of some of the more optimistic reformers, however, not much of a dent has been made in executive government control over parliaments, particularly lower houses. There may have been a minor shift in the balance of power between the legislature and the executive, but everywhere the initiative in policy and legislation still rests very firmly with the executive, and the influence of the legislator as such is marginal. Now, that underlines the comment that I just made, that it has been allowed to decline and under Howard almost totally destroyed. Perhaps because the balance has not radically changed, he goes on, discontent with parliamentary institutions has not gone away. On the contrary, there's been a noticeable radicalisation of the parliamentary reform movements and a tendency for reformers to move towards radical constitutional and institutional changes. There's been a shift to a view that Parliament is unreformable and that it is necessary to go over Parliament's head, so to speak, to the people and the Constitution. So we now know we can't do that in Australia without the parliamentary... well, first of all, the Parliament has to organise the referendum and they have to support it. So that, hence the title of Harry Evans' paper, Parliament, the Unreformable Institution. I cannot tell you how much thought this has given me over the years. And I believe we have some answers which have not been canvassed anywhere else. It's ironical that this phenomenon of the radicalisation of the reformers is most noticeable in the UK, where of all places the parliamentary reform movement had the greatest success. The committee system was established by the British House of Commons has been the most successful of all. Now, there's no need for me to go on in that vein, except to say, have a look what's happening in the House of Commons right now. They have established an all-party committee and they're examining the ex-Prime Minister Blair as to the reasons why he and his government committed Great Britain to the Iraq War. And out of that is coming some very, very interesting testimony about misleading the British people, about people dying for a cause that was questionable. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be good, for example, if we could have known, instead of waiting 35 years, why 400 Australians had to die in Vietnam and why thousands of Australian troops are still suffering major mental and physical trauma as a result of that experience, and that these people were conscripted against their own wishes into serving a cause which could not be justified. That's the importance of a parliamentary committee. That's the importance of a system that can examine people. Look at the United States. The heads of the armed forces are compelled to come before the committee in the United States and they're cross-examined. What is your strategy in Afghanistan? When do you think we can get out of Afghanistan? Is the strategy working? Is the government of Afghanistan gaining more control? Is there any likelihood of the Afghani troops ever really being in charge? Are we winning against the Taliban? Wouldn't it be magnificent in Australia if we had that opportunity? Wouldn't it be good to have a committee that looked at the banking system in Australia? And to be able to say to the head of the bank, how do you justify the fact that we put in millions of dollars of taxpayers' funds and you, Westpac, have just put up your interest rates, and you, Commonwealth Bank, have put up your charges, and you feel you own this country nothing? That's the sort of debate that's going on in the Senate committee system in the United States right now. And this is where Obama's saying, I'm going to bring some form of taxes in. Now you can expect him to get a hard time, just as Chifley got a hard time in the 1940s when he said he was going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Nationalise the banks. And of course, all hell broke loose. You can't have banks in public ownership, for God's sake. And what was it, a Labor government years later under Keating that sold the Commonwealth Bank and took the control mechanism out of the system? At least we do have a Reserve Bank in Australia. But I want you to feel the importance of the Parliamentary Committee and feel the importance of it being nobbled. I want to then go on also to give you a view about some things that make the parliamentary committee system better in England than it is in Australia, before I go back to what Harry Evans has said. For example, it is established practice in the House of Commons that if you, the government, want to establish a parliamentary committee, you, the opposition, will choose the chairperson. Not in Australia. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, when I was a chairman of the Home Fund Committee in New South Wales, and I'll spend a few minutes on this. They spent something like $350 or $370 million, which they gave to a private organisation, FanMac, in guaranteed support so that FanMac could oversight a loan system for people who didn't have the means to enable them to get a house. Turns out that FanMac then charged this exorbitant interest rate, and FanMac, being a private company set up by the government with their funds guaranteed by the government, they couldn't fail, yet they still charged a high interest rate, so there was no risk, so they didn't have to charge a high interest rate. But when the Secretary of the Treasury, who was a member of the FanMac board, made a statement to his Premier Greiner, who then made a public statement about problems that he found with the process in the FanMac boardroom, guess what happened? FanMac then threatened him with the corporations law, which forbade him from, without board permission, revealing the business of the board. Now just think about that. If you've got public-private partnership, and we as the public invest a huge amount in that, and they have control by 51%, right? They can tell us whether we need to know and what we need to know, and we have no recourse to law at all. So when you see public-private partnership and commercial in confidence, say in the building of the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, in which Minister Breton played a vital role, start asking questions in your head as to what's happening. Ask Ted Mack about the tunnel and he'll tell you how many billions it's going to cost us over the life of that contract, a contract which we could not find out about because it was commercial in confidence. Nobody in the world ever knew how to build a tunnel before then. Had to keep it a secret. Harry Evans goes on to say there is now an extensive literature analysing the work of the committees. Whether there is any connection between the establishment of the committee system and the noticeable decline in government control over the House of Commons is a moot point. That decline appears to have begun in the 1970s. This is in Great Britain. But they have been accelerated by the committee system. Although a government with a reasonable majority still has very strong hold over the House, there has been a notable increase in the number of occasions on which the House does not do what it is told. Just an aside there. In Great Britain, even now, with the greater and greater stranglehold the political parties have on the House of Commons, if you're the member for Wollongong, you can stand up and publicly disagree with your party because it's not in the interests of the city you represent. Can't do that in Australia. Immediately the party heavies are onto you. You get disciplined within the party room and you're told in no uncertain terms, you step out of line again, mate, and your pre-selection's on the line. In other words, we do not have free speech. But there is a tradition in English politics even now that your electorate comes first. Well, how radical is that? I mean, they were the people who elected you. Of course it should come first. And of course you should have the opportunity to stand up and disagree. And they have a 3-line whip system where they decide the priority of 1, 2 and 3. And if it's a priority 1, you're expected to toe the line. However, if it's a priority 2 and 3, you can vote according to your conscience. Why is it headlines in Australia when there's a conscience vote? Why is it headlines in Australia when the party leader says, no way we're going to have a conscience vote? The most recent, Harry Evans goes on, the most recent manifestation of the Commons kicking over the traces with the election of Betty Boothroyd as Speaker. I had the privilege of meeting her, by the way. Apparently the government took note of past hints and kept right out of the matter. As the House of Lords, it praises as a non-partisan restraint on government had been sung in many places, a constitutional authority recently suggested as the Lords is now a restraint on government of both parties, contrary to demands of reformers over many years, it should be left as it is. Now that's an interesting concept. That's my comment there. It's perceived as being a house of the privileged. It's perceived to be not elected, toffee-nosed, if you like. But yet there is a tradition in the House of Lords where members feel compelled to speak out against the government of the day or against the government of which they were perhaps a member in the past. And the Speaker of the House cannot proceed anywhere after getting out of the speakership, so can't be nobbled, but can be kicked upstairs into the House of Lords. And the House of Lords is a place where ex-Prime Ministers and ex-Speakers reside, as well as distinguished lawyers and other distinguished citizens. So against my basic feelings about an unelected, as it were, toffee-nosed upper house, or at least a feeling in the United Kingdom that the House of Lords is some constraint. Harry Evans goes on, it would be a great irony if that view prevailed and some people came to the conclusion that the only way to get a properly functioning House of Parliament is to keep the old House of Lords. Notwithstanding this apparent improvement in parliamentary performance, the parliamentary reform movement in the UK has become very radical and more vociferous. The reformers have turned to fundamental constitutional and institutional reforms as a solution of the perceived problems of the system. In recent years, without coming upon programs, it is not possible even to dip into the literature on governments and politics in recent years without coming upon programs called for a written constitution, an elected second chamber, a Bill of Rights and a federal system. Now, Geoffrey Robertson covered that Bill of Rights debate earlier on. The jurisdiction of the European Court has greatly added to the demands for a domestic Bill of Rights, and of course that's been now brought into play in the United Kingdom. The program, I'm skipping pieces here, of course you can read it for yourself on the website. The program of the reformers has found its way into the platform of the Labor Party, which went into the last election committed to an elected second chamber and some sort of federal system. That's in Great Britain. Recently I was visited by a Labor peer who'd come to look at elected upper house to see how one might function in a proportional representation type way in the United Kingdom. Now, proportional representation is a system of voting invented in Australia which guarantees significant minorities representation in upper houses. He talks more about the United Kingdom. I mentioned, and I'll reiterate, a story when I was at the House of Commons myself, talking to a senior member of the Labor Party, and he told this wonderful story, which you will recall, but says it all. Remember I said the young Conservative and the old Conservative walking out after question time in the House of Commons, and the young Conservative's really jumping up and down. He's very excited. He said, by gee, he said, we gave the opposition hell today. We really got stuck into the enemy today. And the old bloke propped. And he looked straight at him. He said, my boy, remember this. That's the opposition. That's the enemy. And you think about that in ramification and its ramifications as to the control of the party system over what a Member of Parliament can and cannot do. Turning to Canada, we find nothing less than unravelling the whole country. And then he goes on to talk about the Canadian experience. In particular, a constant theme which runs through the literature and agitation on constitutional change is discontent with the performance of the Canadian House of Commons and their appointed Senate. The enhanced committee system of the House was not a great success. The committees acted like a miniature houses in a way in which that phrase was not intended, because the party whips exercised rigorous control over their membership and activities. Now, many of you, and John Hatton again saying this, many of you will know what the party whips do. I'll just mention it for some who would like to know about it. The party whip is an elected position, elected by caucus or party meeting, and if the government is in, whether you're in power or not, the government and opposition all have whips. The National Party has a whip, Labor Party has a whip, Liberal Party has a whip. Now the whip's job is to round up the troops and make sure they toe the line. That's the whip's job. You front the whip if you don't turn up for a vote, for example, in the House when the division is called. You get carpeted in the whip's office and you're told in no uncertain terms that you've got to get on top of this. What the hell were you doing not being there when we needed you? And so on. It's the whip who organise pairs. In other words, if you've got a function in your electorate and you don't want to vote that day, then you've got to organise somebody from the other side who's prepared to pair with you. That means they withdraw themselves from the opposition, you withdraw yourself from the government and attend to what you want to do, and that pair system generally works and keeps the numbers fair so that you can attend to urgent business. If you didn't have a pair system, then in many ways some of the outside activities that have got to occur during parliamentary sittings couldn't work. But the whip also gets stuck into you if you say the wrong thing, and will carpet you before the Prime Minister or the Minister or the party leader or the party spokesman if you step out of line. So the party whips are very powerful people. They spoke in the House of Commons in Canada that as for the Senate, the replacement of that body with some sort of elected second chamber has been close to the top of all the reform agendas for over 10 years. And so it goes on to talk about the problems there in Canada. And he finishes up by saying, it can be predicted with considerable confidence that there will be radical constitutional changes in Canada because there's nowhere else for the country to go. He talks about New Zealand. One is that they are the closest of all to what Lord Halsham described as the elective dictatorship, with no written constitution, no entrenched rights, no second chamber, and no provincial governments. He goes on to say that in New Zealand, on paper, the committees look impressive. They're very active. Most bills are referred to them. They habitually take evidence from affected groups and interested members of the public on legislation, and legislation is frequently extensively amended in the course of their deliberations. Governments still appear to have the final say, however, even on the committees. Now, one of the reforms, and this is again me speaking, one of the reforms that we pioneered when we were in the balance of power was to instigate legislation committees in New South Wales, so that the House could refer a piece of legislation to a committee system to be examined. Now, that's absolutely vital. In Sweden, it's a matter of course. When I was there in '89, if there's a legislative program which has wide effects on the health system, for example, or on petrol retailers, on whatever, then that sector of the community has the opportunity to comment on the effect of that legislation. And isn't that what it should be? I have seen time and time and time again in Commonwealth Parliament and in all state parliaments the use of the gag and the guillotine. where the Leader of the House, and I can see Frank Walker now for the Labor Party standing up and doing it. I can see Tim Moore doing it as the Leader of the House for the Liberal Party. I move that all the stages of this bill shall be concluded by 3 p.m. tomorrow. Right? That's the substance of the motion. That means the legislation may have only been introduced yesterday. The second reading speech may have been done yesterday, or it may have been done this morning. The Leader of the House, usually the Attorney General in government, can get up and say, we're going to dispense with this by 5 p.m. tomorrow. That means that all of the clauses of the bill, all of the committee stages of the bill, all of the debate of the bill is going to be ended at 5 o'clock, whether you have a say or you don't. I saw that happen under Askin, Lewis, Willis, Greiner, Carr, Unsworth, Fay. Doesn't matter which political party. When it comes to the end of the session, you watch what happens. If they have control of both houses of Parliament, they will gun that legislation through under what they call the guillotine, and there's no way in the world it's properly debated. Never mind bounced off those affected in the community as to how it's going to affect their businesses and their way of life and their taxes. No way. So you see, the parliamentary committee system, the legislation committee system, is very, very important. And we also had in our charter reform an impact statement had to be prepared by the government on that piece of legislation. Guess who quietly went about dismantling these charters of reform? Olive's good friend, Mr. Carr. Don't ask Olive about Mr. Carr. She might dong you one. After all their hard work in stopping the, and her groups stopping the Port Kembla smelter, he then put legislation, and winning in court, he then put special legislation through, which just pushed all that aside. Left them without a feather to fly with. Now, I'll go straight to Australia. Looking at Australia, it is found that most of the parliamentary reform measures have been concentrated in the Senate. With the establishment of the standing committee system, in more recent times the enhancement of the scrutiny of legislation through the establishment of the scrutiny of bills committee and the new procedures for the reference of bills to committees. A conspicuous feature of Australia's recent history has been the diversion of reform demands into non-parliamentary channels and the establishment of a structure of non-parliamentary safeguards and institutions which are still the subject of intense foreign interest. I refer particularly to freedom of information legislation, the overhaul of administrative law, that's the Administrative Review Committee that looks at regulations, and the establishment of the Administrative Appeals Jurisdiction and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The enhancement of other review mechanisms and the establishment of a host of other institutions such as independent prosecutors, independent commissions against corruption, criminal justice commissions and so on. The establishment of these institutions has put Australia well ahead of other countries in the field. My comment, what's interesting about that is the very job that Parliament is supposed to be doing, because Parliament is unreformable, you have to do it by setting up institutions outside of Parliament. It could be said of the 4 countries under consideration, Australia has exhibited the most radical changes in its system of government, though purely legislative and non-constitutional means. It then goes on, I'll leave out a little more. The conspicuous difference between Australia and other 3 countries, however, is that there's been no real radicalisation of the parliamentary reform movement. Over to you, folks. This is your big opportunity. He goes on later to say the Republican movement, following the line taken by the principal academic proponent, Professor George Winterton, and if you read columns by George Winterton commenting on the Constitution and so on, they're worth reading in the Sydney Morning Herald usually. Professor George Winterton is very anxious to convey that it aims only to replace the head of state with some sort of indirectly elected presidency, which would amount to a Governor-General without the Crown. So, as an aside again, the big debate here is, do we have a president? Is that president elected, or is that president appointed like the Governor-General by the government? And what powers would that president have? And will it in any way separate the president from the elected House, as is the case in the United States? Will we go down that track to any extent or not? And that's a fairly complex argument. Later on, he says, it might also be contended that there is another example of Australia having not completely caught up with overseas intellectual fashion, which will arrive and gain a hold on these shores just as the weakening in other places. This might be so if one could dismiss the constitutional agitations of the other countries as merely the latest preoccupation of the chattering classes, unquote. This, however, is clearly far from a sufficient explanation of the discontents which have arisen in these countries. They clearly reflect real problems affecting real people. In the United Kingdom, the inhabitants of the provinces feel burdened with the centralisation of Whitehall. Isn't it interesting how these observations in 1992 come home to roost in our school here of community empowerment? Later he says, in New Zealand there's a real sense of frustration with a system whereby a government winning 40-odd% of the votes can virtually instantly dismantle all the economic and social measures put in place by the party which won the 40-odd% in the last election. You're looking at Keating. You're looking at Hawke. You're looking at Fraser. At various times, they won with less than half of the primary votes in our country. They get 100% of the public service working for them and 100% of the resources. Clearly, that is not a good thing. He goes on to say, this leads to the major significance for Australia, which I would draw from the radicalisation of the reform movements in other countries. The most striking feature of those reform movements is that they're demanding the very institutions which Australia already possesses. So we're not painting a completely bleak picture here. He then goes on to say the significant thing about these reform movements, as I have characterised them, is that they do not really have any new ideas. He goes on later to say the first 8 decades of the 20th century were something of a mini dark age politically. You can see why he's so popular. And the mini renaissance which is now taking place is a rediscovery of the political principles formulated in the 18th and 19th centuries. Going through a rediscovery of principles of previous centuries and a rediscovery of the validity of these principles. Now, there's quite a considerable amount to go on with in terms of the UK committee system, where the chairperson is nominated by the opposition. I have covered that. I have covered legislation committees. He goes on to say that with the legislation committees in the Senate, the most important advantage of this proposal is it allows an explanation of public participation in law making. In other words, you can apply as an ordinary citizen to appear at a Senate committee examining an area of your interest or a piece of legislation of your interest, and you can give your perspective if they allow that committee system to work as the way it should. One of Australia's greatest strengths is the highly developed system of the technical scrutiny of legislation through 2 Senate legislative scrutiny committees. It's also a feature of the Senate which foreigners frequently come to study. A recent report by the House of Lords, this is back in '92, for example, seeking to improve the scrutiny of legislation in that House, drew heavily on Australian experience. Then he talks about the need to coordinate between committees and a need for the committee system to have a greater scrutiny of regulations. Remember we mentioned that earlier? That when the Speaker rises and you are governed in the first 10 minutes, when the Speaker stands and says, have ministers' papers to lay on the table, ministers in order of seniority, from the Premier on, stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, I wish to lay on the table the following regulations. And they are regulations which cover your everyday life, what you're going to pay, what you can say, what you can't say, and this and that and so on. They control your life. They lay on the table for 15 sitting days in New South Wales, and if they're not contested, they automatically become law. And regulation after regulation after regulation, year after year, decade after decade, pile on top of one another so that you don't know where the hell you are. So a legislation review committee, particularly in, I'm just seeking a phrase here, it's minor legislation, but there's a special word which covers the making of regulations. In other words, there ought to be a parliamentary standing committee, all-party committee, which regularly examines legislations which are compiled one on top of the other over the many years. Legislation committees should have that job. He then goes on to questions. He talks about a Bill of Rights, which we've already covered. He talks about government control over legislation. He talks about the role of independents and minor parties. And delegated legislation was the phrase I was looking for, which is regulations. He then goes on to talk about regulations where he says some countries are ahead of us in this because there's a much greater use of delegated legislation which does not come into effect until it is approved by both houses, and delegated legislation which can be amended by both houses as well as merely vetoed by either house. Now in New South Wales you can stand up and move disallowance of that regulation within that 15 sitting days, but if the government has the numbers, you just simply get voted down. You can't amend that regulation, you've got no opportunity to do so. So you might only agree with a small part, or disagree with a small part of that regulation, and you can't even alter it. That gives them dictatorial powers over your everyday life. Okay. I'll just read this last two paragraphs. I mentioned before that part of the program of the reformers is proportional representation. They promote proportional representation because they say it leads to no party getting a majority, to a European-type situation where the parties have to compromise to come to an agreement about measures. This is seen as good thing, because the alternative is having someone who, as I have said, has 40% of the vote running the country. So it's significant that proportional representation is a large part of the reformers' programs in other countries. Now, where do you want to go to from here? I don't know. But I do want to ask you this, because I have read the speech. Be frank. Did you find it boring? Put up your hand. Right. Did you learn something from it? Okay. That's all I want to know. Yeah. Thank you.
Before we throw this open for questions, in fact, Harry Evans and John Hatton understate the severity of the problem. So I've just made 9 dot points, which I'll put on the POL340 website. But the overwhelming majority of the things that I'm about to say quickly have occurred in the lifetimes of everyone in this room. So when we look at the authority of Parliament, the authority of Parliament is so fragile that even its own legislation can be overturned outside the Parliament. So after the war, when the Curtin and Scullin governments wanted to introduce a national pharmaceutical scheme, it was passed through both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but was subsequently challenged by a small group of pharmacists in Victoria in the High Court, and the legislation was subsequently overturned. So Parliament doesn't have it all its own way. It can make laws, but there is a higher authority to the Parliament, which on some occasions can do damage to that legislation. For those of you who were around in the Whitlam period, there are at least two things that we can draw on from the Whitlam period. First of all, the Whitlam government was elected on a platform to introduce Medicare, Medibank, and to pass the Pipeline Energy Authority Bill. This is the artefact that each of us use every night, or most of us use every night, to do our cooking or heating with, and that is to get oil and gas from the West Coast to the East Coast. On 3 occasions, the Senate, which was in the majority of the Conservatives, voted against this, and it was only by going to a double dissolution, which Whitlam only just won in '74, the double dissolution joint sitting of both houses of Parliament, the first time it's ever happened in the history of the nation, got those 2 pieces of legislation through. So all of us who have got our green Medibank cards in our pockets, you can thank that, but you can't thank the Senate for thwarting and frustrating the wishes of the government. Then the next year in '75, when Whitlam government was dismissed, it was dismissed not because the Senate voted against the budget, but the Senate refused to vote on the budget. And there's nothing in the Constitution which says that the Senate must sit and vote. It was only when Fraser convinced Sir John Kerr, well may we say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General, was only when Fraser convinced Kerr that the Senate would actually vote that he appointed Fraser the stand-in Prime Minister. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is that even royal commissions cannot be guaranteed of getting to the truth, which John and Harry and others are so keen to get to. If you look at the recent case of the Royal Commission in the Australian Wheat Board, various people were subpoenaed. You cannot ignore a subpoena, otherwise you'll be jailed. But when some people were brought in, they had instant memory loss, instant amnesia, sorry, I can't remember. No, I don't remember that day. No, I lost my diary for that day. No, the dog ate the computer, etc., and a whole range of things. And if you go to the Godwin Gretsch case, where he appears in a Senate Estimates Committee on the basis of a faked email and asserts that X, Y and Z occurred, in subsequent investigations to this day hasn't revealed who wrote the email. Could have been Erica Betts, could have been Malcolm Turnbull, might not have been, but whoever it was, someone wrote a fake email. It didn't just descend from the sky, and we don't know who wrote that. So we now have a mysterious, anonymous, ethereal author of emails running around in Canberra. And on the issue of emails, as I speak, senior public servants in Canberra and possibly in other state jurisdictions are already crafting their emails with a view to the 35-year rule or the 30-year rule, looking at their archival integrity. So they're either being oblique to the point of being obtuse or oblique to the point of being bland, but they're not putting in the email what they would like, because the email can be subpoenaed, the email cannot be erased, and the email will eventually find its way into the archives. So here's another twist on the truth. So if you look at the conscience vote, for those of you who can remember George Peterson, the member for Illawarra, you would not have gotten a stronger Labor man than George Peterson. He was on the far left of the Labor Party. He did not countenance voting with the Conservatives ever. He voted against the Unsworth government's Workers' Compensation Act and for the bill, and for his pains was expelled from the Labor Party. He'd been a member of the Labor Party all his life, from the time of being an old teenager when he'd stopped being a member of the Communist Party. If you have a look at the gag and the guillotine, you will hear on Wednesday from Elisa, and if you want to chase this up further, go talk with Olive, and that's that when Helen Hamilton fortuitously got her case about the Port Kembla copper smelter into the Land and Environment Court against the grain, against the odds, unbeknownst to her, while she's preparing on the Thursday night to leave Port Kembla and drive to Sydney and appear the next day on the Friday in the Land and Environment Court. Up the road in Macquarie Street, Craig Knowles, Minister for Urban Planning, I use that title loosely and very creatively, and the Premier Carr were ramming through Parliament from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock, first reading, second reading, third reading, lower house, upper house, etc. So that by the time Helen arrived the next morning, the government had already passed the Port Kembla Special Provisions Bill, which said that the Port Kembla copper smelter would open, and under no circumstances would it not open. So her capacity to appear in the Land and Environment Court, the ground from under her disappeared completely. And if you want to look at less than 50% of the vote, John has been using the figure of 40%. Well, we can do better than that. The Peterson government in Queensland, where there is no upper house, it's one of the few state jurisdictions in the Commonwealth that doesn't have an upper house, which could raise the question in your minds as to why do we need other upper houses in other states. That's another question. He was getting in on some occasions on less than 17% of the vote, which gave him 100%. Well, we know what happened to Jockey Peterson and Lady Flo's scone recipes. And just on the children overboard, a footnote, if you read one book as an outcome of this, which is other than the stench in this Parliament, I suggest you go read Tony Kevin's book, A Certain Maritime Incident. It's the story of Civex 10, SIVE/10, Special Illegal Entry Vessel number 10. Now, Tony Kevin is an interesting dude. No left-wing, feral, tree-hugging fool is this man writing about allegedly illegal vessels coming to Australia. Former ambassador to Poland, former ambassador to Thailand, former ambassador to another country in Southeast Asia, which I forgot, a career diplomat who is so disgusted by what the Howard government and Reith and his bozo friend Downer are doing with regards to foreign affairs and to so-called illegal refugees, that he writes this book. And it is a very, very sobering account of the extent and lengths to which governments will go to defend, protect, obfuscate and traduce the truth. It is well worth reading. And invoke the armed forces. It's well worth buying.
And invoke the armed forces.
And invoke the armed. A Certain Maritime Incident by former career diplomat Tony Kevin. So John's reading and commentary on Harry Evans' speech, quite sobering, but it perhaps understates the contemporary situation. There's at least 3 or 4 situations there that we can all remember. You all remember this Commonwealth Government official, Godwin Gretsch, her career official, who has since left the public service and who is a psychiatric mess, sadly, who testified under oath. You know that case. You know the case of refugee boats coming to Australia. Most of you can remember the Whitlam government and the dismissal and the double dissolution. Most of you know about the Bajocki Peterson government. Most of you would remember George Peterson, and most of you would remember the passage of the special provisions legislation for Port Kembla, and if you don't, you will by Wednesday afternoon. So in fact, I think the situation that John describes understates the matter. I'll go and sit down now, and John will field questions. Once again, no mobile phones, and we don't want live stories. Just short, sharp, to the point questions.
Can we start with Bega? Is there any questions that Bega would like to ask? Thank you. Did somebody interpret that question? My hearing Now, about public-private partnerships, what did you want to know?
Should we have it at all, given the pitfall, eradication that we don't have triple pairs?
On rare occasions only, in my view, and that view is supported by the ex-Auditor General of New South Wales, with whom I've had extensive discussions on public-private partnerships. Because of all institutions, government can access loan money as well, if not better, than many others. So consequently, they have the wherewithal to have the long-term planning, the finance necessary for long-term planning put in place. Secondly, the thing that happens in public-private partnerships is you get public servants sitting down round a table talking about an arrangement that is a contract with people on the other side who could run rings round them because they live their whole life doing that, whereas the public servant doesn't. And consequently, you end up with a lopsided agreement. And thirdly, as you would know from the Cross-City Tunnel and other examples in New South Wales, that it's got to the ridiculous stage now where private enterprise wants a guarantee that the government will pick up the tab if certain elements of that contract fail. So you've got a ridiculous situation where you not only lose your power to influence what's happening, but you're outgunned in the negotiation stage, and in fact, they can make a profit at the public expense, which is fine if it was a level playing field. And that's the last point I want to make, is that if you're in the inner sanctum, you can get into the public-private partnership. If you're not, you've got no show. Any more questions from Bega? Bateman's Bay? No, one. Another one. Right.
I'm interested in proportional voting too. I have a problem with that. I don't know why we have preparation vote.
This is without going into the whole mechanism of preferential voting compared with first past the post. If you read the literature on it, the fact is that if you have first past the post, you can get a person elected with a very small number of votes. It's easily explained. If you say you had 13 candidates, then obviously you've only got to get ahead of the other 12, and if it's a fairly evenly divided vote, your total vote has to be relatively small for you to get over the line. The simplicity of first past the post, of course, it's easily understandable, and therefore in the case of a small number of candidates, it's probably a very fair system. The other part of proportional or preferential voting is that if so-and-so doesn't get elected, I'd like this so-and-so to get elected or this so-and-so to get elected, and consequently you have a multiple say as to over influences over which you've got no control. For example, if the field comes out fairly evenly, then the second preferences become first preferences and so on. And I can talk about how the voting system works and how it's been fixed by political parties and so on. But they are arguments for the preferential, and there are obviously arguments for first past the post. But there's just a couple of sweeteners there you can think about.
I just want to jump in and point out we had proportional voting in New South Wales for about 8 years behind. So we used to have proportional voting in state level for about 8 years in New South Wales.
And it served local government fairly well, actually. And at the state level, but it served local government fairly well. But, you know, that's a debate we could have, and there's very strong viewpoints either side of that. Any more from Bega? Bateman's Bay? Anybody coming?
We have other questions here, thanks.
John, can you comment on the situation that the different parliamentary systems described in the US and UK, both resulted in the legislatures in authorising their governments to invade Iraq.
The first part of the question, who authorised it? You're saying the method of voting in the United Kingdom.
It was examined by quite different systems as you described, but the outcome was very similar. Both of the governments were authorised to go to war.
I didn't quite catch the sense of that.
Two different government systems in the United States and the United Kingdom.
The main distinction between the parliamentary committees
now,
in the UK and the Congress.
See, the problem is not the way you're expressing the question, which I think is excellent. It's my hearing. As I explained before, because I've been in Parliament 22 years, I've got hearing loss.
Say two different systems of government, either sides of the Atlantic, same outcome.
Oh, yeah.
So there is no question.
No, and that's because there wasn't a parliamentary vote in either case, I don't think. See, Hawke took us to war in Iran without a vote of the Parliament. And I think that's fundamental, that there ought to be at least a vote in the Parliament if you're going to commit your nation to war. That's one of the 10 Commandments, by the way. Okay, thank you for that. Any more? Bateman's Bay, please.
Yes, John.
Yep.
Hi, John. I'm just wondering how long has the party whip been part of Australia's political system?
As far as I know, the party, and somebody who's expert in this, like Glenn, for example, as far as I know, party whips were in vogue in the 1800s, so they go back a long way. It's the hint in this paper is that parties began to take control in the 1880s. Well, in order for them to take control, they had to have somebody to exert discipline. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. I think we have. I'll check this and don't believe anything that anyone tells you at any of these things. Go do your own research. But I'm pretty certain that when you have an organised political party, you have a whip. And particularly in the case of the Labor Party, which wants to see the decisions taken at caucus enforced. Less so on the Conservative side of politics, but not much less so. So all the while you've got organised political parties, and you start to get them from the 1890s in New South Wales when the Labor Party is formed, up on that till that time you've got free traders, you've got protectionists. You don't have political parties as such. See, therefore you have, I can't recall anyone in the 19th century enforcing the will of the political grouping, be protectionists, free traders or whatever, enforcing the will of the collective decision that group is taking in the Parliament. Once the Labor Party comes along, they decide to vote a particular way, and that vote is enforced when they move from the party room into the Parliament. So certainly in New South Wales it's from the 1890s, and once the Labor Party is formed, other parties see that loose collections of ad hoc people combining on certain occasions for certain events is not going to work. So then you start to get the rise of other political parties, and certainly by the Second World War, when you've got the Liberal Party formed by Menzies, you've had the National Party, or the Country Party as it was, formed in the 1910s, the 1920s, and the Labor Party. The whip system then is in full flight, simply because they want the discipline in the Parliament that has been agreed on in the party room. I think
Glenn and I would disagree on that point about. He said, I think that they perceived that it worked well to have this total discipline. My case rests on the fact that a parliament should work as a parliament of different opinions, and from that you can come to a consensus, And if you can't do it on the floor of the House because of the complications, you should refer it to an all-party committee system to examine that legislation and report back in depth so that you can then make a decision on the floor of the House. But of course, as I think Glenn was aiming at, from their point of view, that's inefficient, in inverted commas. Right, any more questions from Bega?
Yeah, we've got one. Do we have one more? No more provided. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Let's go for it. Any more? Batemans Bay? None. Right, Mossfire, Nowra? Yep. Nowra?
I've got no question. No questions here, John. Thanks, John.
Mossfire?
Yes, John, we've got some questions here.
Thank you.
John, what power, through the Australian Constitution's corporation law, would work through the present situation of the banks? Could you explain that?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I can make some comments. I think it's important to have a publicly owned bank. And the reason for that is, and I'm in I'll explain a difficult situation that confronted us as independents under the sale of the Bank of New South Wales, which is owned by the members of the state. We were more or less bludgeoned into that decision because they said it would affect the credit rating of the state. We did not have independent advice of sufficient depth to be able to argue that. So I must admit to a failure here under those circumstances, although in my heart I solidly opposed that. But we were inveigled into voting for the sale of the state bank. They said that it needed $500 million at that time to recapitalise the bank. As a matter of fact, for the amount they sold the bank and then it was resold later, it was clearly misleading. But anyhow, how does a group without the support of a committee system analyse that? So one of the ways to do it, I think, is to have a government-owned bank, a people's bank. They then can set interest rates at a fair rate and compete in the marketplace and set an example. And of course the profits from that bank could flow. The second thing is, one of the things that riles me, and this is an independent view, compulsory legislation was brought in for compulsory superannuation in which billions, tens if not hundreds of billions of dollars were accumulated forcibly from contributors throughout Australia. Why in heaven's name they're not under the direct control of Treasury and used for public works as well as investment to give some return to the superannuation funds, I'll never know. What happened is they are the source of cheap funds for those who play dice with our money. The third thing is that we do have a central banking system which does set interest rates, but there's no compulsion and no penalty if people don't follow that. So there's a few observations on the banking system without having a great deal of in-depth knowledge on that. Any further questions, Mossvale?
Yes, John. About the power of the whips in Parliament and the threat of, no pre-selection. With the rise of independence, aren't those powers being lost a little bit?
If you've got a balance of power situation, the whip still exercises the power, in fact, even more so, because the vote could be won and lost on one vote. And if somebody didn't turn up...
Yes, but can't that politician become independent That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah,
so the threat of being of pre-selection can become a no threat.
Well, no, there is I'll try and make it as short as I can. Remember in a previous lecture we talked about ticking the box. They make it easy for you. You tick the group. You don't have to number all the candidates. You tick the box. Right. So if you want to vote Labor, you tick the box. They automatically select the candidates for you and the preferences for you. If you want to vote Liberal or National or whatever it is, you tick the box. That's what gives them the power. That's the first thing. The fact that the majority of Australians feel that they want to take the easy way out. The challenge is to form a group that will give them a platform which gives them basic rights. And then hopefully you get sufficient members of Parliament then who are not subject to the party whip. The possibility of change within the political parties away from that disciplined system are remote, because the political party membership is falling. That should tell us that we could vote independent, but people tend to be in a habit of voting for one party or the other. Even if they say, well, we've had enough of Labor, we're going to vote Liberal, you're still handing the power to the pre-selectors and the whips. So unless you've got a situation where you've got a significant number of people in the Parliament, that's not going to change. But in individual electorates, if you elected an independent member for the Southern Highlands or for South Coast or for Kiama or Wollongong or Kira or whatever, then that person is free of the party whip. They don't have to do anything that they're told to do by anybody outside of the Parliament, unless, of course, it sits well with their conscience and with their constituents. Hopefully that's the way they'll vote. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of...
I can add a bit to that.
Yeah, good.
Let's look at the case of George Peterson. George Peterson was a long-time member of the Labor Party, a long-time member for the Illawarra, stood on the far left of the Labor Party, having been formerly a member of the Communist Party. And when the Unsworth government wanted to wind back the quote-unquote excessive payments that were occurring in workers' compensation, without looking at occupational health and safety on, say, a building site or something like that, it became pressured by the insurance companies to look at quote-unquote excessive payments under workers' compensation, introduced legislation to make it difficult for ordinary working folk to press claims for workers' compensation. George Peterson said, this legislation is anti-Labor. This is the sort of legislation that we could expect from the Conservative side of politics, and I will not vote for it. Intense meeting between him and the whip. He said, get stuffed. I'm still not voting for it. Intense conversations between him, the whip and the Premier. He said, I don't care. I'm still not voting for it. Come the day of the vote, he crosses the floor and votes against it. Very short time later, he's expelled from the party. At that point, he's an independent member of Parliament. And he sat as an independent all the while that government was up until the time of the next election. The fact that the government had a healthy majority, it didn't really worry the government all that much. Had the government's majority been won, it might have been very, very interesting, but the government's majority wasn't won. At the next election, he's no hope that George Peterson was ever going to get pre-selection again as a Labor Party candidate. So he doesn't even bother to try. He's no longer a member of the Labor Party. You can only be pre-selected to be a member, to represent the Labor Party at an election if you're a member of the Labor Party. So he'd formed his own political parties. The Illawarra Workers' Party had their annual meetings in phone boxes. Didn't have very many members. He stood, or members of his party stood, got nowhere, got less than the required number to get in, and didn't get in. He also, because there's, other than putting up the deposit for you to stand as a candidate, there's no impediment to anyone standing for election in New South Wales. Unless you've got to be over age got to be over 18, can't have a criminal conviction, although that could possibly be argued. It might interest you to know that the head of the Department of Education in New South Wales is a convicted heroin dealer and a convicted heroin addict. And Michael Kutztrotter is head of the New South Wales Department of Education. And
a good man too has recovered from his problem.
Absolutely. That's a matter of public record. So a criminal record is no impediment in and of itself, but generally it is. So if you're over age, not a criminal, and a citizen of Australia, and you don't have a criminal record, and you've got the money to put up for the bond, you can stand for Parliament. If you get a certain percentage of the vote, your footnote reference for this would be Pauline Hanson. Go look at her career in using the federal government's election system to bankroll her campaigns. I'm choosing my words very carefully here. George Peterson didn't get the required number of votes, the percentage of the vote, to get his bond back, and did his money. So, in the case of Peterson, the whip tried to convince him not to vote against the legislation. Once he failed in that, Peterson is expelled from the party, sits as an independent in Parliament until the next election, then cannot get pre-selection for Labor, cannot get pre-selection for anyone, but he can get pre-selection for himself or his own political organisation. The fact that he formed a political party is neither here nor there. Stands at the next election, because he's not the official Labor Party candidate, gets very few votes, gets so few votes that he did his deposit under the Electoral Act and didn't get his money back.
Yep. Any more questions? Yes. Thank you.
Two questions. One is on the preferential system. How can we weed out the dummy ballots, the dummy candidates on the ballots? And the second question is, the Bank of Australia, when it went down in the 1800s, the directors had to pay the debts of the bank. Why can't those laws be overturned? Thank you.
I don't know much about the second question, but I'll come to that. In terms of the preferential vote, are you asking how it works?
No. When the dummy candidates put on ballots, like their candidates for their...
Dummy candidates, right. As a matter of fact, that's regularly used, both in local government and state and federal elections. The recent legislation to overcome that is that if you want to register as a political party or group and gain the advantage of that by having tick the box mechanism on the ballot paper, you've got to have 750 signatories as party members. That's 750. I think it's only 500 federally. And they have to be registered voters and not members of any other political party. And so that was one way of stopping a tablecloth type sized ballot paper for the upper house, where you had the Australian Party, for example. Now, as far as dummy candidates are concerned, there's nothing to stop you in the preferential system. For example, if you wanted to get candidates into the Wollongong City Council, standing, say, 13 candidates, knowing that 6 or 8 of them don't want to get elected anyhow. What they do is that they draw a number of votes to them on election day from the people who support them, and it might be a relatively small number. But what happens under the preferential system is when they are excluded, their second preference goes up the line. And when they're excluded, their second preference goes up the line. And when the next one's excluded, so you get a stacks on the mill situation. As the also-rans are eliminated, their votes pass up. And the minute the person gets 50% plus 1, they are elected, their second preferences pass down. Now, as long as you understand that, you realise how you can fix the system. And so, yes, you can get dummy candidates who don't want to get elected, simply in order to pass votes up the chain. And proof of that is that how many of the tail enders of the party political candidates' teams get elected? If you get 1 or 2 on the Senate ticket for New South Wales Labor Party, mate, you're in. But if you're 4 or 5, chances are you're out. So there's a lot of jockeying for positions there. So you could argue that they are dummy candidates. Now, I wanted to point to this book by Allan Ramsay. It's really good reading. It's a collection of his articles in the Sydney Morning Herald over the whole of his lifetime. Each one of them is a good little read. And it's good for bedtime because you can read just a few pages and then you're at the end of it. On Howard here he says the first casualty. Well, you know what that means. The first casualty in war is truth. Other people's wars, to stampede the battle. The fall of baby Alex, you can work that one out for yourself. Players getting desperate. The great love affair. On Tuesday night, Bob Hawke got to bed at 2:30 in the morning. Just over 5 hours later, he was strapped to his seat in an RWF BAC 11 and took off from Canberra for Melbourne, and so on and so on. A view from St Itas, historic third term, thank you voters. That's Hawke again. It gives you a wonderful insight into the power plays, the backstabbing, the jockeying, the cheating, the lying, the promises that were never kept. And he gets equally stuck into both sides. And I'd recommend it to you as a good read and a good insight into politics in Canberra. So this one I just mentioned it. Ruth is going to... Yeah, I'll read it. I'll give you the detail in a moment. On the last day, Ruth Richmond, the author of this book on my life, is going to come up for a book signing on the last day. So I promised I'd mention that for her. Allan Ramsay, A Matter of Opinion. It's printed by A&U. I don't know what other details you want. I got this at Kiama. You'll find it in most bookshops. But I assure you it's entertaining. Now, the other one I wanted to mention, I mentioned the Parliament, an unreformable institution. There is a grassroots political movement I didn't know anything about and picked up called a Grassroots Political Movement for Political and Social Change. Concept discussion paper, March this year, amended in March last year, amended in August last year, and they're just canvassing the idea, which I'm virtually been canvassing without knowing this was in existence, but not with the principles of open government. And in that they refer to the American experience and the international connections in the sort of movement that will, I hope, result out of this summer school. It's hard to tell you which website here is active. That's the problem. They give the links in the United States, but maybe you could help me out there, Glenn. I don't know. Have a look at it and see what you think. Are there any more questions?
Just before there's a couple of questions, the issue of... I'll put this website... It's an alphabet... It's a couple of lines. I'm not going to read it out. So I'll put it on the POL340 website. Just on pre-selection. Pre-selection is quite important, and we know from the experience of Christina Keneally, recently appointed as Premier and Miss 73%, according to that respectable organ, the Sunday Telegraph, yesterday. We see how this kind of works. Now, when the Labor Party was scouting around for candidates back in the day, head office's eyes lit upon the Keneally family, in particular Ben Keneally. And Ben Keneally was Christina Keneally's husband. He's the Australian of the partnership. Laurie Brereton and his sister Deirdre Grusevan had been grooming Ben Keneally to go into the New South Wales Parliament. He was the next cab off the rank until someone in head office realised that there were far too few women in Parliament and it would be a good look if the ledger was evened up by the appointment of a woman. So they pre-selected Christina Keneally. So she's in effect an accidental candidate. Not only is she an accidental premier, but she's an accidental candidate. No one in the party really wanted her at that time, except those who wanted to enforce the equity rule that a certain number of candidates should be female. So she gets into Parliament that way. She's one of the least Labor of all candidates that we've ever had in the history of parliaments in Australia. Her membership of the party was short, never been a member of a trade union, which is the traditional route, So she gets in, and no one at that time could have foreseen that she was going to become Premier. So pre-selection, interesting, not always does the party get what it thinks it wants to get, and the outcomes and the consequences of pre-selection are interesting. And I'll put this on the website.
Right, Wollongong, it's your turn. Let's go.
A footnote on the Allan Ramsay book. A footnote on the Allan Ramsay book. Recently, he was interviewed by Philip Adams on Late Night Live, and I think it was a full 1 hour interview, and I'm sure it would still be available on the ABC's website.
It has been repeated last Saturday.
Thank you. Yeah.
Repeated last Saturday.
That would be ABC Radio National Late Night Live. That'll find it.
Oh, good, thank you.
John, I've always wondered when you said the 50% plus one, then the other lot, the second preference passes down. Is there any sort of juggling of whose second preferences come out of that? Because some of those votes will have different second preferences from the others. Which lot do you put in 50%, or do you not get to control that?
The person who's elected, their preferences are distributed. Their preferences are distributed.
Thank you.
Okay? And you can make good use of that in council elections. I've organised that, and that's how we got the Combined Progress Associations elected, and that's how I eventually became mayor of Chairperson. Now, right.
Oh yes, John, I'm very interested in the People's Empowerment Party post. Can you tell us what the colour plate for application for membership is?
That has not been finalised. What I wanted to do, and I have to do it outside of this forum, is I want 750 signatures within 2 weeks. Is going to be difficult, but not if we got 70 people prepared to sign up 10 others who are not members of political parties. So you could get the required number of signatures very quickly if you got 75 people signing up 10 each. So what I'm asking is that if you were prepared to sign up yourselves, and I don't want an answer now because I don't want to get involved with the university, but if you're prepared to sign up after you've seen those 10 commandments, of course, then and act as an organiser to collect 10 or 20 signatures, I can give you the rule anyway. The rule is, by the 15th of March, 750 people have to be absolutely rock solid, checked out by the Electoral Commission as being signed up members of that political party who are entitled to vote and who have no other party political membership, right? And the electoral officers said they need 2 months to check it out. Well, they won't have 2 months, but they would have, I hope, a month. If we could get this organised by the end of the first week in March, with 750 signatures done so that preferably from the electoral roll number, the full name, the address, the person and the authorisation is completed so that the electoral office will have no problem in checking them off and therefore be able to do it within a reasonable time, you can get your party then nominated. So that's the challenge, and what I would do is ask people just to contact that vhatton@charleshaven.net.au, register your interest, and then it's up to us to carry it on outside of the university. And you'll want to know more detail before you get into it, I understand that, and so on. But it's a new concept which follows on from this paper. That is, don't get involved in whether you're in favour of private enterprise or unions or whatever. Get involved in, are you in favour of true freedom of information? Are you in favour of giving us the tools of access to the democratic system? We don't care who you are, sign up, because that's the only way it's going to work, to have members of Parliament who are signed up by statutory declaration to these things. Now, I'm going to talk with the Faculty of Law here about whether law students want to become involved, not in the party thing, not in the election thing, but if you were formulating a law on freedom of information, what would it contain? If you were formulating a law on defamation, what would it contain? And then we might even get people to have to sign up to legislation which is workable. So that's the basic idea without going into it too deeply. Yep. Because I feel a bit uncomfortable in this forum doing that.
John, obviously the legislative committees and parliamentary committees are backbone to obviously having some more effective democracy.
Yep.
Through, say, the election of more independents, what needs to happen on the parliamentary floor for those committees to be up and running as effectively as you see them need to be for us to have a much fairer democracy?
Right. Now, if you wanted to change things, say in New South Wales, and that's your first opportunity, or on the floor of Wollongong Council or any other council in New South Wales, you have to achieve the balance of power. And that's the only way we were able to do it. For the first time, an independent chaired a parliamentary committee in decades, and that was me. For the first time, you had a chairman, remember me saying this for the people who were present, where the staff came up to me and said, Mr. Chairman, what would you like us to do? I said, what do you mean, what would you like us to do? There's the terms of reference. We're going to go wherever we possibly can within those terms of reference. So, Mr. Chairman, you're not giving us any instructions. No, I'm not giving you any instructions. I'm telling you this is the area of research, and if it's covered by the terms of reference, if you don't believe it is, come back and talk with me. Otherwise, I want to know what's happening out there. I want you to help me compile the information. I want you to help me compile who we're going to subpoena and what we're going to ask them. And they were gobsmacked. That hadn't happened for decades. So what I'm hoping is that you can get sufficient numbers throughout, because of the disenchantment of both sides, to get it back to a balance of power in New South Wales, only on those principles of accountability, and at the same at the local government level. And if it works, it will have an effect federally. Because the Parliament's not going to reform itself, and I agree completely with Harry Evans. It's not ever going to do it. We're going to have to do it from outside.
Okay, we might bring questions to an end there. Keep those cards and letters rolling in, and keep posting things on the website. So, on behalf of Harry Evans, I think we'd like to thank John for today's lecture.